One.
All right, welcome to another episode of Artful Tuesdays. Today I have Nicolas Krusek, and we are going to be talking about music and poetry. And specifically, Nicolas has been kind enough to show me a couple of songs that he's chosen that are these are operas based on Midsummer's Night's Dream, or what are these? They're not the whole opera, obviously. It's like a whole song or symphony. What are we going to look at, by the way?
Well, so Shakespeare's plays are full of self-contained songs that have been set many times over the past few centuries by different composers. For example, The Tempest includes the famous song Full Fathom 5 Thy Father Lies, which many people know, even independently of the play itself, which has been set by numerous composers, most recently by Vaughan Williams, who wrote some famous musical settings of Shakespeare's songs. So for today, I've chosen two songs that come from the play A Midsummer Night's Dream. And these are songs that play a very specific role within the narrative arc of the play. So I'd like to, first of all, isolate the songs as poetry. I'd like to look at the text. First, of course, we'll give a very brief sort of introduction to the plays, the action, the characters, just to set up a little bit of context for the audience. Okay. Then I want to look at each of the two songs as poetry, looking at the words, the verse structure, the imagery, whatever. And then we'd like to look at the musical setting of the two songs by Felix Mendelssohn. But first of all, perhaps can you say a little bit about Shakespeare's poetry, or have you had much experience with songs in Shakespeare, or how different productions of Shakespeare's plays treat these lyrical interludes?
Definitely not how different, I've said this many times, music is not my forte. And I've read this play, I've seen it a couple times. I'm sure there's different uses of music in the different productions that I've seen. In fact, I saw Austin Shakespeare did one for their free summer Shakespeare in the Park. They did a Midsummer's Night Dream. And I've always liked this play. It's a fun play. It has great quotes and great little story. It's a fun, but I never really notice the differences in music. I just don't have that ear, I guess, or the training for it. And which is one reason I'm interested to learn more about what, you have to say. I do have a little bit of knowledge about his poetry. That's his sonnets, as opposed from his theater and theatrical plays and the language of his plays. And, I do think there's a difference, even if you extract something. It could be very beautiful, it could be wonderful, many things, but there does tend to be a difference, even in Shakespeare, between his dramatic dialogues and speeches and the text of his plays versus his actual poetry. But for the purpose of what we're trying to figure out today is we'll read through. So what you want to do, Nicolas, right, is read through one of these poems, try to understand a little bit about what's going on in this is actual dialogue from the play, I'm assuming, the speech, one of these, right?
Both of these songs are actually incorporated in the texts of the plays. One comes from Act 2 and the other one comes near the end of Act 5. And actually, one point that I want to pick up on from what you just said about different productions that you've seen of Shakespeare's plays, and you said that you weren't necessarily aware or listening for the musical treatment of these particular songs. There can be quite a lot of variation in how different productions will treat music in Shakespeare. For example, I've read all the plays. I've seen mostly amateur productions of Shakespeare, student production, amateur productions. I've seen very few professional Shakespeare productions. Now, the kind of musical setting that we're going to see from Mendelssohn, for example, or other great composers who have written music for Shakespeare, whether Tchaikovsky or other composers, that gets into very elaborate music where you get trained soloists, a chorus, an orchestra of some size. Very few non-professional productions can afford such elaborate musical music. So actually, a lot of productions that we may see, even professional or semi-professional productions, will have the song just sung by a single person, by a single character, like a single fairy, or maybe with a very bare bones sort of musical accompaniment like a guitar or a lute or something like that. The point being that very few theaters will have the resources for the kinds of elaborate musical treatments that we're going to be hearing today. So that's just
Well, so I guess one question is like, how essential is these elaborate, you know, symphonies that you're going to be playing to the actual enjoyment of the play? Like, I would assume Shakespeare in the late 1500s had the more simple version of this in his own singing, right? Like at the Globe Theater, I doubt they had a full symphony for him in one of these, or did they? I don't know. Do you know what they would have
that would
had
have
back
been an
then?
anachronism, since the symphony orchestra as we know it today
Well,
had.
I mean, like they didn't even for its time. I'm saying, like,
But
was there something elaborate?
we know that from the actual stage directions in Shakespeare's plays, that the Globe Theater would have had, for example, trumpets, where Shakespeare writes a flourish of
Hmm,
trumpets or a flourish of hautboys. There would have been oboes. There would have been
okay.
lutes and some string instruments. There's references to this in Twelfth Night. The Duke's speech at the beginning. There's references to music. There's stage directions involving music. So very likely they would have had some instrumentalists on hand for these kinds of situations. But no, certainly nothing like the kind of elaborate music that we're going to hear. And I think it's important to stress that, for example, the musical setting of Mendelssohn that we're going to be hearing today comes from the 19th century, which was a time when audiences would have expected, or certainly would have been attracted to, very elaborate musical settings accompanying plays, which is why the
Mm,
19th century was a period when composers like Tchaikovsky and others did occasionally write music for theatrical performances of Shakespeare's plays. Or another example would be Edvard Grieg's music for Peer Gynt by Ibsen.
yeah.
So it's also a very elaborate sort of symphonic setting. That's the sort of thing that we don't see much of in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like the trend, like today we have a trend of multimedia in theater. Like very few plays have no multimedia, nothing projected on the screen in the background. Like they almost always have something like that. And it's part of the, milieu or whatever of our time in theater, just because we live in such a multimedia. So like in the 19th century, it was this beautiful music. That's what they admired and what they liked. So they attached that and added that to Shakespeare, and that was their addition to the greatness of Shakespeare's words. Shakespeare had his own rendition of these, but they were probably much more simplistic, I imagine, and maybe not as grandiose as some of the stuff we're going to hear today. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that just touches on the broader point that every generation reinterprets or reimagines
Yeah.
Shakespeare according to its own values, interests, preoccupations. So what we're
Today
going
we
to
dumb it down and we put up pictures.
yeah.
That's our contribution to Shakespeare, is we simplify it, the language, and we put up pictures. Great. Okay, so you want to get into one of these poems and read them, and then we'll see if there's much
So
to discuss
let's
about it.
give just a very brief, necessary bit of background to the play for
Yes.
those who may need a little bit of a refresher or who haven't read it. So, A Midsummer Night's Dream, it's a comedy. It's one of Shakespeare's earlier comedies, probably written around 1595 or slightly earlier. The play is set in Athens. Funny, I was just there. But it's
Oh
set in
yeah.
Athens during ancient times, specifically during the reign of Theseus, who in the play is described as the Duke of Athens. Basically, there's four groups of characters in A Midsummer Night's Dream. On the one hand, there's the fairies, who are sort of behind the scenes. They're like the puppet masters. They're pulling all the strings, influencing events. And there's actually one of the background elements to the play is there's this conflict going on between the king and the queen of the fairies,
Mhm.
Oberon and his queen Titania. They're having this tussle over a young child, this changeling boy of whom they both claim possession. And of course, Oberon plays a rather nasty trick on Titania in order to get the changeling boy from her. He has her fall in love with a man with the head of an ass. We'll get to that a little bit more. So
A
the fairies are
donkey, to
very,
be clear.
yes,
An
that's
ass as in a donkey.
as in a donkey,
Just to be
exactly.
clear.
So the fairies are one very important group of characters. Then you have the Athenian ruling classes, which of course is Theseus himself as the Duke of the city, and his queen to be Hippolyta, who's actually an Amazonian queen, but she's been wooed and is about to marry Theseus. So there's a royal wedding looming on the horizon. Then there's the two pairs of young Athenian lovers who find themselves wandering through the forest in the middle of the night, and there's these overlapping love triangles. There's all sorts of confusions, and they become embroiled with the magical pranks of the fairies. So and they basically belong to the aristocracy, but they're not socially, they're not quite as high up as Theseus and Hippolyta and the ruling classes. And then at the bottom end of the social spectrum are the tradesmen, whom Shakespeare refers to as rude mechanicals. And these are basically tradesmen who ply various trades. There's a joiner, a weaver, a bellows mender, all these weird professions that we don't seem to have anymore today. And so these tradesmen, these rustic individuals, are putting on a performance of a play for the upcoming royal wedding, the wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta. And of course, that the play within a play comes in Act 5, and it's a horribly botched affair, which gives rise to a lot of humor and a lot of unintentional comedy. So we have characters drawn from different strata of Athenian society, and then of course the fairies themselves, who are removed in being, not strictly speaking, mortal characters. And as we'll see in a moment, the different groups of characters are actually reflected in the kind of verse that Shakespeare employs. Now, am I missing anything crucial here as far as the plot of the play is concerned?
Nope. I think that's what I recall as well, about the crisscross lovers and the mismatching of the lovers. And that's, to me, that was always the fun of the plays.
Yeah.
Mistaking this and that and going there, and he's falling in love with her and she's falling in love with him, and they're he's one guy falls in love with another girl and she doesn't believe him, and all that, that gives rise to the great language about love.
It's not with the eyes but with the mind, and therefore is when Cupid painted blind, and all those wonderful lines. So
Very
can
good.
we then have a look at the first of our two poems, the You Spotted Snakes?
There we go. Okay.
So shall we read it first and then discuss it a little bit? Now, the context here, this first poem comes from the second act of the play. The background here is we've just met the king and queen of fairies. We've met Oberon and Titania. We know a little bit about the squabble between them. They're fighting over this child, this changeling boy. In this scene, Titania is just about to go to sleep, and she's commanded her fairies, the fairies who attend on her, to sing her to sleep. And so this poem that we're about to read is the poem sung by the fairies attending on Queen Titania as their mistress is about to fall asleep. So do you want me to read it, or would you like to? How do you want to do this?
Well, what would you prefer? Do you like reading it?
Okay, I'll read it. So there's two stanzas here. I'll read, I'll just read both stanzas.
Yeah, let's go.
So here we go. You spotted snakes with double tongue, thorny hedgehogs be not seen. Newts and blindworms do no wrong, come not near our fairy queen. Philomel with melody, sing in our sweet lullaby. Lulla, lulla, lullaby, lulla, lulla, lullaby. Never harm nor spell nor charm, come our lovely lady nigh. So good night with lullaby. Weaving spiders, come not here, hence you long-legged spinners, hence. Beetles black, approach not near, worm nor snail do no offense. Philomel with melody, sing in our sweet lullaby. Lulla, lulla, lullaby, lulla, lulla, lullaby. Never harm nor spell nor charm, come our lovely lady nigh. So good night with lullaby.
Okay.
Any comments about the poem before we discuss it as basis for a musical setting?
Well, so I mean, the way I normally approach poetry is I read it a couple times, I go through it, I look at the meaning of the words and what I think they're trying to say. And that's and then, putting it together within the context of the whole. So, this is saying something, it starts off by saying, "You spotted snakes with double tongue, thorny hedgehogs be not seen." So it seems like the person is talking about some kind of, what's the word? Trickery is going on, like a two-faced person. Would that be correct, do you think?
Not exactly. So
Spotted snake.
I
Well,
think
because
the
like
purpose.
snakes, hedgehogs, which are like harmful to other people, be not seen, like get those thorny
I see
hedgehogs
what
out of here.
so what's
Roots
happening.
and blind worms do.
So the fairies in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, they're very small, delicate creatures. And this is
Uh,
interesting because, of course, in Elizabethan folklore, fairies were often sinister, wicked beings who could play pranks and do very, very nasty things. But Shakespeare's fairies are sort of graceful and delicate. And yes, they are powerful and they can influence events in serious ways. But so here Titania is about to fall asleep in the middle of the forest. She's this petite female fairy creature. She's about to fall asleep. And essentially, what her fairy attendants are singing here, it's a kind of an incantation to keep away dangerous creatures, to keep
okay.
dangerous creatures
So
away
keep
from their
away
queen.
snakes, keep away the twisted tongue, double tongue. So
Yeah.
there's no double meaning to any of these things. Like there's no multiple. It's when she says double tongue, it's literally because a snake has a double tongue at the end.
Unless there's an oblique reference to Oberon, the king, who here
So
is
this,
sort of in conflict with Titania. So unless there's an oblique reference to
yeah.
Oberon as a potential threat, I'm more inclined to take it literally, that the fairies just want to keep away dangerous critters, snakes,
Yeah, so like
salamanders.
a thorny hedgehog, literally like the newts, the blind worms, do no wrong, come not near our fairy queen. So they're telling this all the creatures of the world to leave the fairy queen alone, essentially. That's what that
After all,
statement.
a
Yeah.
forest is a dangerous place for a woman to fall asleep
Yeah.
unattended. She's attended by her fairy attendant. So I think that's really the point of the poem.
So Philomel with melody, sing in our sweet lullaby, lulla lulla lullaby, lulla lulla lullaby. Never harm. So I speaking about this from a poetic angle, what do you see? Because I'm not seeing anything other than the literal meaning here. Poetry is almost purely figurative. And so this is what I was talking to you about ahead of time before we were talking about this. Maybe you can inform me. So like to me, for instance, a poem has to ride on its own meaning. That's one thing that makes it a poem. So if you have to start incorporating things from outside of it, like in this case from the play, it's no longer a poem, it's a piece, it's a puzzle piece to a broader context, which is wonderful. And it's great language. It sounds fun and I enjoy the beauty of it. But I don't have much else to add from the poetic angle other than, I'm curious. I want to learn from you. So like the lullaby, that's something I can imagine being sung, right? And it could sound very, with the right notes and hitting the right tones with the right music coming in can sound really great as a sound in and of itself. That's a great sound. What do you like this second stanza? Philomel with melody. What's going on there, do you think?
So you've brought up a number of, I think, very important points. And actually, everything that you've said points to the idea that I think Shakespeare would have expected some sort of musical accompaniment to these songs. And something that you and I were talking about before we went live on air was you said that a poem, once you add music to a poem, it's no longer a poem. Because a poem as such has its own music, its own rhythm, its own imagery. Once you add music to it, it becomes something else. And because this poetry is relatively simple, and because I think it is meant to be taken at face value, I think it really does cry out for some kind of musical treatment, whether a really elaborate musical treatment like Mendelssohn gives it, or even something simpler like just a lute or a guitar in the background. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, and I think Shakespeare himself would have expected that there would have been some kind of instrument being played while the actor was singing. I'm not exactly an expert on how Elizabethan performance practices, how the songs were performed in
Neither am
Shakespeare,
I.
but
We need
certainly
Anne Chickalella for that.
Yeah, but certainly I think he would have had some such expectation. Now, there is one specific comment I want to make about this as poetry, and it has to do with the structure of the verse itself. Now, we know that the basic verse form that Shakespeare uses in all of his plays is blank verse, which
Yeah.
is unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. And for those not familiar, iambic pentameter means a line of verse with 5 pairs of syllables, where the stress is on the second syllable of each pair. Da 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 da. A horse, my kingdom for a horse, to take one particular example. And actually, so most, I would say probably 70 to 80% of Shakespeare's characters and Shakespeare's lines are in blank verse, iambic pentameter. Would you say that's probably a fair guess?
I mean, yeah, I don't know much else that I'm sure he mixes it up for certain reasons at particular
Which
times
I'll get to.
for to like really emphasize something.
Yeah,
But as far as I know, and I'm not a Shakespeare, like I've read most of the plays, but I'm definitely not an expert on his form in all of his plays. I mean, his sonnets are very standardized
yeah.
as a Shakespearean sonnet. But yeah, so that I would assume yes.
Yeah, and one, I have to qualify one thing. I said that I described a blank verse as unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter, but actually Shakespeare does sometimes make use of end rhymes. And actually, because A Midsummer Night's Dream is one of his earlier plays, it makes more use of end rhyme than, say, some of the later plays like King Lear, Macbeth, etc. Now, there are situations where Shakespeare does depart from iambic pentameter, and 2 situations in particular. Characters belonging to a lower social class. So, and that would include the rude mechanicals, tradesmen from this play. It would include servants, musicians, any characters belonging to a lower social order. Those kinds of characters will speak in ordinary prose. So they won't speak in verse at all. They'll just speak in ordinary prose, and that sets them apart socially and also in terms of text, in terms of manner of speaking. Now, the one other situation where Shakespeare doesn't use blank verse, which pertains particularly to the poems we're looking at today, is supernatural characters. And here Shakespeare uses a different kind of verse called trochaic tetrameter, which is a type of verse where you have 4 pairs of syllables with the stress on the first syllable of each pair. So dee da, dee da, dee da, dee da. Now, the reason iambic pentameter is the default or the go-to verse for Shakespeare is because natural spoken English falls into a kind of an iambic pattern, or at least in most situations. So when Shakespeare uses trochaic tetrameter for supernatural character, like the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream or the witches in Macbeth, it actually sets them apart. It creates a slightly eerie or slightly mysterious quality. So think of the opening lines in Macbeth, the opening scene of the witches in Macbeth. Where shall we 3 meet again, in fire, water, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, where's the place upon the heath there to meet with Macbeth? When you hear that right away, okay, we're not in mortal territory. We're not among human characters. There's these strange characters, these weird sisters, as Shakespeare calls them, and they're set apart by a different manner of speaking, a different manner of verse. And that's used consistently throughout Macbeth, whether it's in their fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air, or later on the famous double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. That's trochaic tetrameter. And that's the verse used by the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream, who are, to be sure, not quite as sinister as the witches in Macbeth, but still, the use of this particular type of verse sets them apart from all the other characters of the play, including the aristocratic and ruling Athenians, as well as the rustic tradesmen putting on their play within a play. So any comments about that, Kirk, about the particular verse that Shakespeare is using here?
No, I think that's good explanation. This is something that is the unusual form within his broader context of story and dialogue that is able to help you differentiate the different types of characters and where they're coming from. So that makes sense. So this next stanza, the weaving spiders come not here, hence you long-legged spinners, hence, that you're saying that that's the form you were just talking about.
Well, the whole poem, from you spotted snakes with a double
Yeah.
tongue all the way down to so good night with lullaby. Both stanzas of this poem are in this make use of this particular type of verse form, the trochaic tetrameter. And if you read it out loud with exaggerated emphasis, thorny hedgehogs be not seen, newts and blindworms do no wrong, come not near our fairy queen. There's 4 pairs of syllables, and the stress is always on the first syllable of each pair. So it deliberately goes against the grain of how English is normally spoken, normal conversational English.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Very
that,
cool.
in a way, that contributes to this feeling of incantation. I'd said, one of the fairies attending on Titania is speaking this poem as a kind of an incantation to ward away dangerous creatures from their mistress. And the particular verse form here, I think, contributes to the incantatory, is that a word, feeling of this particular poem. And of course, that segues nicely into the discussion of the music, because one of the things that a composer has to consider in a musical setting of a poem is the natural rhythm of the words themselves. So Mendelssohn, in setting this poem, and Mendelssohn's setting was of the German original, but the recording we're going to listen to is of an English translation. Still, it has to respect the verse and the actual metrical structure of the poetry itself, as we've just discussed it. So any comments before we turn our attention to the musical setting?
No, let's keep it moving. Let me know what I want to learn, because this is not the way I look at poetry. I don't really care about iambic that much, or what kind of thing that's like a very 10th level step that I would take to enjoyment of the poetry. I'm interested in the words and how especially because we're reading in our own language, right? So, but I do think it's interesting from a full analysis of Shakespeare to know, what you just said. I didn't quite know that myself, about the difference between the incantation of the fairies and things like that. So now I'm interested to hear what is the music that's being set and what he's doing that's special about that, to make it, to enhance it and to add to it.
Yeah, and before we get to that, I just want to make one point, picking up on what you just said. When I read poetry, something that I do sometimes have difficulty with is certain kinds of poetic devices, imagery, metaphors, allusions, especially with certain poems, if I'm not exactly clear on what the poet is alluding to, that can be a bit of a challenge. However, when I do read a poem or analyze a poem, the meter is actually one of the first things I look at. And I think that's just because of my training as a musician, that it just comes naturally to me. And that's because poetry is not something that has always come easily to me. It's over the years I've often struggled with. Actually, Shakespeare is one of the few poets that I do find sort of comes to me naturally. But a lot of poetry, especially a lot of
his plays or his sonnets.
Both.
Come naturally to you?
Both the plays. I quite like the sonnets. Yeah, but I admire both the plays and the sonnets. But a lot of later poetry, sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, I often struggle with. And very often, rhythm is one of the first things that I rely upon just to get some sort of a handle on how the poet is using.
But for you, it's like the rhythm itself. Like, so you actually notice the rhythm. And then what does that do for you? Does that tell you, like, if it's like an iambic pentameter rhythm, does that help you understand the meaning of the poem? Like in a sonnet? So if they're all iambic pentameter with the very, similar structure of their rhyme scheme, does knowing it's iambic pentameter help? Or what does it do for you?
It does, especially when a poet does something to the meter that goes against the grain. Like, for example, enjambment, when you have a line that ends sort of where you have a grammatical sentence that ends in the middle of a line, which that will have a particular kind of effect. or where you have a line that is sort of incomplete in terms of the number of syllables, or whatever. There's lots of things, and then there's other things like rhyme scheme, the kinds of consonant and vowel sounds that a poet uses. So in general, for me, reading a poem out loud, listening to the rhythm of the words, the sound of the words, the sound of the consonants and the vowels, anything I can do to connect the words on the page with something that I can actually hear out loud or hear in my mind, that very often helps me at least get some sort of an entry into the world of a poem.
Yeah, I wish we had some poems for you to show me that aspect. I do know that as well, and there's a lot, especially with enjambment, in the way that as you read it and you understand more and more of the meaning, you can impart that in your reading either to others or to yourself in your understanding of what's going on in the poem. And so I do think there's values in understanding it to some degree as a second or third level explanation of the poem itself, in terms of like what the poet is trying to convey with switching up the meter in this one line, for instance. And there is a lot of that in great poems, for sure. But I don't think it's much here, except overall, like you were saying, it's an incantation, which is all we need to know, I think, as like a elementary or a non-academic enjoyer of Shakespeare.
Absolutely. And there's a kind of a broader question underlying our comments here is, what sort of steps ought one to take when approaching a poem, when analyzing a poem? And or to enjoy a poem. And that's something that someone coming from a literary or poetic background versus someone coming from a musical background, we may take a slightly different paths to approach at the same destination. And if we looked at several different poems, maybe in a future episode, we can look at some poetry by a different author and explore the question from a different angle. There's lots that one could discuss here. Now, before I play the music, I'll just say a few words very quickly about Felix Mendelssohn and about how this setting came about. So Felix Mendelssohn, born in Hamburg in 1809, died in Leipzig in 1847, was a 19th century German composer, born into a prosperous and cultured German Jewish family that converted to Protestantism when Felix and his siblings were very young. Mendelssohn actually had an engagement with Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream at 2 points in his career. When Mendelssohn was 17 years old, he wrote a celebrated overture to the play, an overture inspired by the play, in which the different themes of the overture correspond to the various characters of the play itself: the fairies, the ruling classes, the young lovers, and the rustic tradesmen, respectively. So that overture was written in 1826. Now, exactly 17 years after that, so Mendelssohn is now 34 years old, he was invited to compose incidental music, and nothing fancy here. Incidental music simply means music to accompany a production of a play, like film underscoring. That's basically the principle here. So Mendelssohn was invited to compose incidental music for a production of this play in Berlin. That was in 1843. And so he composed some instrumental numbers, some vocal and choral numbers, including the 2 songs that we're going to listen to. So let's, and actually, Daniel, if you could please put the text back up so that we can actually see the words as we're listening to the music. One thing that I want you to pay attention to is repetition of words. So Mendelssohn doesn't just take the poem from point A to point B. He's actually going to repeat several words, particularly in the first stanza, the bit about the newts and blindworms do no wrong, come not near our fairy queen, and then the whole business about the lullaby, lullaby. That's going to be repeated at length as well. In fact, at certain points, Mendelssohn even adds words that are not in the original poem, like, if you're listening very closely, you'll hear hence away. That's not in the poem as written, but Mendelssohn adds that as well at certain points. So as you're listening to the music, listen for word repetition. One last comment I'm going to make. So this poem has a verse, chorus, verse, chorus structure. So the verse is the "you spotted snakes," etc. And then the chorus, which is the same both times, is the "Philomel with melodies, singing our sweet lullaby," etc. So the verse is sung by a single singer, and then the chorus is sung by a group of singers. So that's one very important distinction. Okay, so let's listen to the music now. This is Mendelssohn's "You Spotted Snakes."
You spotted snakes with double tongue, for the hedgehogs be not seen. Newts and blind ones do no wrong, come not near our fairy queen. Newts and blind ones do no wrong, come not near our fairy queen. Come not near our fairy queen. Hence away, hence away. You spotted snakes with double tongue, for the hedgehogs be not seen. Hence away, hence away.
So that was the verse that was sung by a single singer, a single soprano.
Now, normally they would be taking action on the stage as well, I would imagine, like moving around. They're not just standing there singing necessarily. They're probably also moving. Who is this character singing this?
These are the fairies. The fairies.
All the fairies. Okay, this is the fairy chorus.
They're
Okay.
basically her handmaidens or whatever you want to call them.
And I forget, is Robin part of this? Is he one of them? Or is that Oberon's?
No, because Robin Goodfellow is the servant to Oberon.
Oberon. Okay, that's
He
right.
would be
Yeah.
a young man.
He's the other one. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
this is like a group of them and they're all around. Like, so there would be a setting on stage of maybe this is some forest, magical forest or something with Titania and all of her, fairies. And then the fairies maybe moving around in some kind of dance or sway or something is possibly also happening, correct?
Yes, exactly. If this is performed in the context of the play itself, then they may have various accompanying gestures, to keep away the snakes and the newts and the blind worms. That's very much up to the stage director, up to the stage director's imagination. So now here's the chorus. So that was the musical setting of the first stanza. And I hope you and everybody in the audience noticed the quite extensive use of word repetition by Mendelssohn here, especially on the whole lullaby and so good night with lullaby, etc. One basic quality of the music, and this is, I think, a characteristic of a lot of Mendelssohn's music in general, but one of the things that made Mendelssohn famous, even with the first overture that he wrote when he was 17 years old, is his what people call Mendelssohn's fairy music style. And it's something, it's not just limited to A Midsummer Night's Dream, but you find it in his chamber music, his symphonies, a lot of Mendelssohn's music, this very mercurial, delicate, Quicksilver type music. I mean, this particular composer was really famous for this fairy music style. It comes through brilliantly in the overture and also in this particular song. I mean, you can just picture these very delicate, wraith-like, ethereal creatures singing this music. So he's not using heavy brass instruments or anything. He's just using very delicate wind instruments, the string plucked violins and pizzicato strings. So by virtue of the instrumentation, by virtue of the melodies, he really conjures up the world of Shakespeare's delicate fairy-like creatures. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm here. Like I said, I think we're out of my realm. the more I learn, the more it's interesting to me to think about in the 19th century, most people, and for a long time, most people would think of poetry's twin as being painting, even though I think a lot of people think that it's music because there's, sounds to it. But I think it's actually, the more I learn, the more I do think it's probably more attuned, poetry itself to painting than to music. So this is interesting to me.
Certainly in the 19th century, I would say, well, I think in the 19th century, probably many poets themselves identified their art more closely with music than with any other art. That may not have been the case in earlier centuries. I don't know too much about 17th or 18th century poetry, but certainly a lot of the
there's a lot of 19th century poets. So you're right. That's hard to make. There was so much art in the 19th century to make these broad sweeping statements. You're correct. I should be more precise. But I do think like the English Romantics in particular would see more painting than music, for instance, which I know more of them than others. But anyway, the point is that I think there's a tradition of seeing the parallel between painting and poetry. And I do think that overall there's more of that parallel than there is to the music.
So you mean specifically with the English Romantics, there was more of a parallel with painting,
I think
which is
with
interesting
a lot
because
of poetry in general, like from what I've read, I think there's more in line with the methods and the approaches that you take to painting and poetry than you do with music. It's just such a different approach.
which is interesting because when I think of the German Romantics, when I think of Goethe and Schiller, which I'm more familiar with, there I think they're actually quite self-consciously aligning themselves more with musical developments and musical techniques.
And that makes sense. Yeah. From what I've read only translations of them. But I mean, even for what I know, that makes sense to me from them. But not as much in English.
It's not surprising that some of the most important musical settings of poetry in the 19th century are German composers setting German poetry. I mean, here we even have a case of a German composer setting English poetry.
Yes.
So I think maybe
there's a cultural thing too.
A cultural thing.
Sure.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
That makes sense.
The second stanza of this first poem, the music is exactly the same. In the interest of time, do we want to go on to the second poem, the Through This House?
No, I think this one will be fun. We still have to finish this one though, right? Is there more?
Okay, so you want to listen to the second stanza of this first poem?
No, I want to finish the song. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a good song. Okay, I like the song.
I like it too. So the second stanza is the music is basically.
I mean, unless you really wanted to share something on the Oberon thing, I don't want to, take away from what you were planning. Did you want to share something on the Oberon thing, and we can have a link and people could listen to the rest of the song if they want on their own?
Let's finish this song and then very briefly go on to the other one. The other poem is actually quite a bit shorter, so that won't take very much time. But
okay,
no, let's finish this first song then. So again, there's the verse refrain structure. So the verse is just sung by a solo voice, and then when the chorus comes in, it's with a larger group of singers. So here's the continuation. Okay, so that was the verse. And then we get the chorus once again, which features the full complement of Titania's fairy attendants. Here it is. And picking up on something, Kirk, that you said earlier. Now, this particular song, the poetry of this particular song, it's not poetry gold exactly. It's not on the same poetic level as some of Shakespeare's great sonnets. And indeed, it's not meant to be. It's meant to be just very, very plain, simple imagery and language, which is meant to be fleshed out by some kind of musical setting, whether a very simple musical setting like just a lute or a guitar or some single instrument, or the much richer, much more elaborate setting that we get in this case with Mendelssohn.
Well, I mean, some of the things, one of wonderful things about reading Shakespeare is how, because of some degree, the state of the Globe Theater and the limited resources he had, one of the things I enjoy about reading it is just his descriptive language is just so wonderful. And there is a kind of romanticism to it in the way he'll describe sunsets and the whole scenery. And he's not just using bland, boring language. He's trying to make it into an enjoyable experience of the language itself. And now I do think there's something very, like I'm agreeing with what you're saying. I think we're on the same page. There's something very different about that process, which I think is what's happening here, just in a song form. And it's something that he does overall, that then from what I would call straight, aesthetic experience of a poem. And they're just two different experiences. This kind of song, the monologues and the dialogues of Shakespeare, and then like a sonnet, sonnet 94 or something like that, or Marriage of Two Minds sonnets and so on. They're very different in what they do. Although they all have language in them, of course, as the common denominator. So yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, when a composer is setting to music a really great poem, that can be in many ways very challenging and very daunting. In fact, we know that Goethe often disapproved of musical settings of his own work. And there's a kind of a side note. We know that Goethe didn't exactly have a very high opinion of some of Schubert's musical settings of his poetry. Of course, nowadays we think, well, Schubert, great master. His settings of Goethe are great masterpieces. But Goethe had his own ideas about the kind of rhythm and music of his poetry, and he didn't want to be upstaged by some musician or some composer. So I think what we see here with Mendelssohn and Shakespeare is actually a good marriage between relatively simple and appealing poetry and a comparatively rich and elaborate musical setting. So can we just very quickly go on to the second poem and read it and listen to the second piece?
Sure. Yeah. We have like 10 more minutes. So we're good.
Okay, excellent. So shall I read this one, or do you want to?
I'll read this one.
Okay, good.
Okay. Through the house give glimmering light by the dead and drowsy fire. Every elf and fairy sprite hop as light as bird from briar. And this ditty, after me, sing and dance it trippingly. First rehearse your song by rote, to each word a warbling note. Hand in hand with fairy grace, will we sing and bless this place? And bless this place.
Yeah.
It's not a question.
So the context here, this second song comes near the end of Act 5, the fifth and final act of the play. The context is so we've just had the triple wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta and the two pairs of Athenian lovers. We've had the spectacle of the tradesmen's play, their botched performance of Pyramus. Yeah. And then at the end of the act, near the end of the act, midnight tolls and all the humans go off to bed. And then after all the mortals have left the stage, the fairies come out and they do this ritual to bless the household. So, and actually this ties in with what I said earlier about Shakespeare's fairies not being sinister or malevolent creatures. They're actually basically good, basically benevolent. So they're coming out and blessing the household so that the offspring of these three couples will, have fortunate lives and no birth defects and all those sorts of things that apparently fairies had charge over, according to the Elizabethans. So the fairies are coming out, and this is another kind of incantation, but it's an incantation to bring good fortune to the couples who are off doing their thing while everyone in the household is asleep, and the fairies have the stage to themselves. So anything you want to add to that before we listen to the music?
No, I think that's good. Let's see what you got.
All right. So now, those listeners familiar with Mendelssohn's earlier overture, what Mendelssohn actually did was he recycles some of the fairy music from his overture as a kind of an accompaniment to this particular chorus. So let's listen to it. So I can't resist pointing out what we just heard there, those very soft chords played by the woodwind instruments. That's a figure which opens and closes the original overture, the overture composed in 1826. And it's a figure which one commentator had likened to the opening and closing of eyelids. As if you're entering this dream world, you're entering the dream world of Shakespeare's play.
Yeah.
And so now we get the classic example of Mendelssohn's fairy music style. And one thing I'll say about the poem. So the poem has two stanzas. The first stanza is "Through the house give glimmering light," and then the second stanza is "First rehearse your song by rote." So we're going to hear the first stanza set chorally. Then the second stanza we're going to hear mostly sung by a solo voice, a solo soprano voice. And then we're going to go back and hear the first stanza again sung. So there's a kind of an ABA structure here, with the first stanza being A, the second stanza being the B, and then the first stanza being the A once again. As before, we get quite a bit of word repetition in Mendelssohn's musical setting. So that was the first stanza. Now we go on to the second stanza, and here we get a little bit of solo voice. That's it. So any comments about that?
what do you think is the purpose, or I guess the purpose of the repetition in this context? What does it accomplish, or what does it get across to us?
You mean the repetition of the words or the repetition of the whole first stanza?
Well, the words, like you kept talking about the repetition, listen to the repetition. And I assumed you meant the words.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, that's not at all uncommon in any kind of musical setting of any kind of poem. In fact,
I agree.
This is one of the things that Goethe objected to in certain composers setting his poetry, like Schubert, for example. The repetition of words can serve the purpose of emphasis, to reiterate certain words, thereby bringing them into the listener's consciousness a little bit more. But they also serve the purpose of musical balance and musical symmetry. If you were to just take this poem and set each line once, it would be too brief. It would be too short-winded. There wouldn't be any musical meat or musical substance to it. So just music required, because music is an art form that develops over time, that occupies time, the way the visual arts occupy space. Music does require a certain degree of repetition of words, and this is any kind of musical setting, whether it's a medieval chant on religious text, or a Renaissance poem set by an Italian composer, or whatever. So it's in the interest of musical development and musical architecture in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it's trying to do is it's using the techniques that you know about and you're talking about, and musicians study to convey a direct emotion, to evoke a direct emotion from you, right? Like they're trying to get that out of you, and sometimes the words will do it, and the chanting of it in a certain way will kind of get that, get your blood up or get your drowsy up or whatever they're trying to convey to you. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think actually a good illustration.
And this is why I say, though, that it's not poetry, right? And it has nothing to do with poetry. It's very different than what poetry is trying to accomplish. But repetition, in my view, is very important in poetry. And there are times when in poems there'll be repetition, but the most important part of repetition of a poem that makes it special is you rereading it, right? Like poems are meant to be reread, and that's part of you're accomplishing something similar, but in a very, very different way. And yeah, I mean, we don't have time for this now, but it's bringing up a really interesting thought for me in terms of what can be like a longer discussion about the various ways that the various ways that different cultures have developed and the meaning of that. So I find it interesting that Goethe and Schiller and the German 19th century, 18th, 19th century writers really were trying to evoke a symphonic, a musical methodology in their words, whereas in English they were doing something very different, I think, and trying to convey something very different. And there's a fundamental difference between imaginative literature as literature, including what poetry is able to do, and music. I think they're completely fundamentally different art forms, obviously. And I think they impart something very different about them. One is obviously purely emotional, though. The other one, it might have some emotions in it, but it's more about the meaning of all the totality of the poem that it's evoking within you, and the experience you have as such, like trying to convey an actual experience, versus I think a music is trying to convey a specific or some complexities of emotions. And it's very different and very interesting to think about the relationship.
Exactly, because we're talking about the difference between the conceptual level in the case of music and the purely emotional level in the conceptual level in the case of poetry, and the emotional level in the case of music. Which is an interesting thing to think about. And like I it seems to me that what you're saying with much of the music is that the emotional
was put first in certain cultures like Germany, whereas I think the conceptual in other cultures like England, at least in their art. And I don't know if that's
Possibly
true.
France, and possibly France as well.
Which is an interesting thing to think about with what's going on in the different temperaments of the peoples, right? Because English are very subdued generally, right? They're not prone to grandiosities of emotional projection, whereas I think we see a lot more of that in France and maybe Germany.
Yeah. Although I'm not sure I would describe Shakespeare as subdued exactly. Which is, I think, and one of the reasons why he was so profoundly
subdued doesn't mean dispassionate, though. I wouldn't say that. But anyway, this is why I think there's an interesting conversation about the role of each individually.
Yeah.
So no, but I don't think I heard that first song before. The second song, I believe I have heard that before, the Oberon one. The first one was somewhat new to me. So thank you for presenting that and letting me learn a little bit more about the combination of the songs in Shakespeare and how they're done better or worse. Or I guess we didn't talk about worse, but it would be interesting to see the effect this might have on the overall play of having something simpler or not good at all, versus something like this, which really heightens the whole experience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. It's always fun to talk about one of my favorite poets and one of my favorite composers.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Nicholas. And thank you, everybody, for tuning into this week's version or this week's episode of Artful Tuesday. And I'll see you next time.